A man bought a woman at auction like she was livestock. The crowd laughed. The auctioneer didn't stop them. Texas, 1881. At the last cattle sale of the season, a drunk ranch hand dragged a starving horse and a mute young woman to the block together. Two problems he wanted gone before winter. The crowd jeered, threw bottle caps, called her cursed, broken, worthless. She stood with her eyes fixed on the dirt, jaw tight, hands trembling at her sides. Nobody bid on her, nobody except one man. If you want to know what happened next, stay until the end. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The morning started with mud. It always did this time of year when the Texas autumn had wrung itself out and left nothing behind but gray sky and boot-sucking earth. The auction grounds at Haskell County sat half a mile outside of town proper, wedged between a dry creek bed and a cattle pen that needed new boards in 3 places and smelled like it had never once been cleaned. By 8 in the morning, maybe 60 men had gathered, ranchers, ranch hands, a few merchants who had no real business being there, but showed up anyway because a livestock auction was the closest thing to entertainment the county offered in November. Coulter Hayes arrived late. He always arrived late. Not because he was careless, Coulter was in fact a man of considerable and exhausting precision, but because lateness gave him a reason to stay near the back, near the edges. He was a large man, wide through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and gray coming in at his temples at 39 years old. His hat was decent. His coat had seen better decades. He had the kind of face that people didn't approach easily. Not threatening exactly, but closed, the way a locked door is closed. Politely, firmly, and with no apology. He came for 2 purposes: to look at a bay gelding that Harlan Pruitt was putting up for sale, and to buy 2 sacks of winter feed before the prices went up in December. That was the sum total of Coulter Hayes' ambitions for the day. He did not plan on anything else. He was scanning the pen where the horses were held when he first heard the commotion from the main auction platform. A rickety wooden stage at the center of the grounds, where Walt Greer, who served as both auctioneer and general nuisance, conducted the official business of the day. Usually the noise from that platform was dull, competitive, occasionally heated, the kind of noise that had a rhythm to it. This noise was different. It was laughter, but not the easy kind. Coulter turned. On the platform stood a man named Deke Sutter. Everyone in 3 counties knew Deke Sutter, mostly because he made himself hard to forget through loudness and poor decision-making. He was built like a rain barrel that had come loose, wearing yesterday's clothes and last week's sweat, and he was clearly at least 4 drinks into what might generously be called his morning. In one hand he held a rope attached to a chestnut mare that was in a bad state, hip bones pushing against her coat, eyes dull, legs with the uncertain look of something that had been standing too long without proper rest. The mare swayed slightly. She didn't fight the rope. She was past fighting. In Deke's other hand was a second rope. The second rope was attached to a young woman. She stood maybe 5'4". Dark hair pulled back roughly, several strands loose and wind-tangled across her face. She wore a dress that had once been blue and was now faded into something closer to the color of old dishwater, and a heavy wool shawl that was too large for her shoulders. She was thin, not fragile, but the thinness of someone who had been eating less than she needed for a long time. Her hands, Coulter noticed, were not the hands of a woman who had been kept idle. They were calloused, rope-worn, practical hands. She was not looking at the crowd. Her eyes were fixed on some point in the middle distance, somewhere past the auction grounds, past the tree line, past whatever this situation was. Her jaw was set. Her chin was up. But her hands, those calloused, worn hands, were pressed together in front of her, and they were shaking. The crowd was loving it. 2 for the price of 1, gentlemen, Deke announced, spreading his arms wide like a showman who'd gotten religion. Horse and girl, both useless, both yours. The mare can't run, and the girl can't talk. Perfect pair. Am I right? Several men laughed. Someone near the front hollered something Coulter couldn't fully hear, but he caught the tone of it, and his stomach tightened. Walt Greer, up at his podium, had the expression of a man who knew this had crossed a line, but couldn't figure out exactly which rule said so, and didn't want to make trouble finding out. He scratched the back of his neck. He shuffled his papers. He said nothing. Can't speak, can't hear, Deke continued, yanking absently on the rope as he gestured to the girl. Found her 2 summers back working for a sheep farmer down in Callaway County. Named Seraphine, far as anybody knows. Don't ask me where it comes from. Don't ask me anything about her, actually, because she can't tell you, and neither can I. What I can tell you is she works. Mostly. When she's not standing around looking like a painting nobody wants. More laughter. A man near Coulter, a feed merchant named Orville Finch, shook his head and said to no one in particular, "Shame. Pretty enough girl, you know, if she wasn't strange." Coulter didn't respond to that. He turned back to the platform. Seraphine had not moved, had not looked at the crowd, but he watched as she shifted her weight slightly, and in that small movement, subtle, controlled, clearly deliberate, he understood something that the crowd apparently did not. She wasn't absent. She wasn't broken. She was enduring. There was a difference, and it was the difference between a fence post and a tree in a storm. One just stood there. The other had roots and was choosing not to fall. Something about that recognition moved through Coulter's chest like a coal ember falling on dry wood. The bidding went poorly for Deke, which was no surprise. Most of the men were there for actual livestock and actual supplies, and the novelty of the spectacle faded quickly into the awkwardness of commerce. A mute girl with unknown background and no paperwork wasn't useful property to anyone who thought about it for more than 30 seconds. The mare was in bad enough shape that several ranchers shook their heads on principle. They couldn't afford to nurse a horse back from the edge when winter feed was already expensive. Bids trickled in, half-hearted, curious, none of them serious. Deke was growing agitated. He tugged on the mare's rope. He paced. He made another joke that landed worse than the first. Coulter was still watching the girl. He watched her notice the mare struggling. He watched her turn, slowly, without calling attention to herself, and reach out a hand. The mare, who had been pulling back against the rope, stilling in nervous shudders, went quiet under that touch. Just her fingers, light on the horse's neck, and the animal steadied, stopped trembling, dropped her head slightly, like something had been released. Nobody else saw it. Or if they did, they didn't understand what they were seeing. Coulter understood. He didn't think about it particularly hard. He didn't weigh pros and cons. He didn't consider what the town would say or how this fit into any plan, because there was no plan. There was only that moment, and then his hand going up, and then Walt Greer pointing at him with the surprise of a man who hadn't expected intervention. $60, Coulter said, for both. The crowd went quiet in the specific way a crowd goes quiet when something unexpected breaks the script. Deke blinked. Hayes? For the horse and the girl. His voice was flat. Together, 60. A beat. That ain't, Deke started. $60 is $60, Coulter said. You want to stand there and argue about it? Or you want to close this out and go find your next drink? The crowd rippled with something between amusement and discomfort. Deke looked around, clearly calculating whether there was a better outcome available to him. There wasn't. He spit on the platform boards and spread his hands. Fine. Done. Walt Greer hit his gavel like he was relieved to be done with the whole business. Sold. To Coulter Hayes. Coulter moved through the crowd toward the platform. Men stepped aside, not respectfully exactly, but with the unconscious give people extend to a large man moving with purpose. He reached the platform steps and climbed up. He took the mare's rope from Deke without a word. Then he turned to Seraphine. She was already watching him, not the distant, enduring look she'd had for the crowd. This was direct. Eyes sharp as dark water, taking him in with the efficiency of someone who had learned that first assessments were important and often final. He didn't smile. He wasn't a man who smiled easily, and he'd learned that false warmth was worse than honest blankness. He simply reached out and held his hand toward the rope at her wrist. She looked at the rope. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. Then she held her wrists out toward him. He untied the rope himself, slowly enough that it wouldn't startle her, and tucked it into his coat pocket rather than leaving it on the platform where Deke could find another use for it. He stepped back and gestured, not urgently, in the direction of the wagon. She walked with him. Behind them, the laughter started up again. Quieter now, more uncertain. Hayes has lost his mind, someone said. Why finally, someone else called out, and the group of men near the fence post laughed again. Coulter didn't turn around. The drive back to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours. The sky had the low, flat look of a sky that was thinking about making something worse of the afternoon. And the road, if you were charitable enough to call it a road, was mainly a series of ruts with opinions. The wagon listed. The mare, tied loosely behind, walked with the slow persistence of an animal that had made peace with difficulty. Seraphine sat on the bench beside him, not close. The bench was narrow, but she sat at her end of it with her shawl wrapped around her and her hands in her lap, watching the landscape pass. Every so often she would glance at him, not with nervousness particularly, with assessment. Coulter kept his eyes on the road. For the first hour he said nothing. He wasn't trying to be cold. It simply hadn't occurred to him what exactly one said in this situation. He didn't know her. She couldn't hear him. He wasn't practiced at filling silence for the sake of it, and this particular silence didn't feel hostile, so he let it stand. Somewhere around the 40-minute mark, he became aware that she was doing something with her hands. He glanced over, careful, brief, and saw her fingers moving, not fidgeting, deliberate patterned motions. She wasn't looking at him when she did it. She was looking at the horizon. He looked back at the road. After another 10 minutes, he said, mostly to himself, "Hayes Ranch is 8 miles out. Got a spare room. Not much in it. You'll be warm." He felt her glance at him. She couldn't hear it, obviously. He said it anyway, which was strange, and he knew it was strange, and he said it anyway. The ranch came into view late afternoon. 200 acres of flat and rolling land backed by a low ridge of cedar trees to the north, a creek that ran reliable most of the year, cutting the eastern pasture. The main house was a long, low structure with a covered porch, nothing pretty but solid. The barn was larger than the house, because that was the correct priority. A bunkhouse behind the barn sat empty these days. He'd had 2 hired hands last spring, but they'd moved on in August, and he hadn't replaced them. He hadn't gotten around to it. That was the honest reason. He pulled the wagon to a stop at the barn. Seraphine stepped down before he could offer any kind of help. She landed sure-footed in the mud, looked at the barn, looked at the house, looked at the mare. Then she moved to the mare without asking permission or waiting for instruction. She put her hands on the horse's face, both palms, and the mare, who had been restless since leaving the auction grounds, pulling against the lead rope with small panicked starts, went still. Seraphine's thumbs moved in slow circles at the animal's jaw. The mare's breathing changed, slowed. Coulter watched this from the wagon. He had horses. He knew horses. He was competent with them, patient enough, and had a decent success rate with difficult animals. He had never, in 39 years, made a frightened horse calm down in under 30 seconds. He climbed down from the wagon and got to work. The spare room had been, at various points, a storage room, a second sleeping space for hired hands who needed to stay close during calving season, and briefly a place where Coulter had kept his late wife's things before he'd finally accepted that keeping them wasn't doing either of them any good. The room contained a wood-frame bed with a reasonable mattress, a washstand with a ceramic basin, a chest of drawers that stuck in the middle drawer, and a window that looked north. It was clean because Coulter kept the whole house clean, not compulsively, but because he'd grown up in a home where cleanliness was considered a moral category, and he'd never fully unlearned that lesson. He showed Seraphine the room by opening the door and stepping aside. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment. Then she stepped inside and walked the perimeter slowly, running her fingers along the window frame, pressing her palm flat against the wall. Testing something, perhaps. Whether it was solid, whether it was real. She turned back to him and made a motion with her hands that he didn't understand. He spread his own hands, palms out. "Don't know what that means." She looked at him for a beat, then nodded once, as though confirming something she'd already suspected, and went to the window instead. Looked out at the ridge of cedars. He left a lamp on the chest of drawers and went to make supper. Supper that night was beans, cornbread, and a cut of salt pork that needed to be used. Coulter cooked mechanically, the way he did most things alone, efficiently, without pleasure, producing results that were adequate rather than good. He set 2 plates on the table, which was a thing he had not done in a long time, and had the briefly disconcerting thought that he didn't actually own 2 chairs in good repair. The second chair had a wobble that he'd been meaning to fix since June. He fixed it in the 10 minutes before supper. Used a nail he found in his coat pocket. It wasn't pretty work, but it held. Seraphine appeared in the kitchen doorway, having found her own way through the house. She looked at the table, at the 2 plates, at him. He gestured to the chair he'd just fixed. She sat in it without ceremony, which he appreciated. They ate in the silence that was already becoming, he realized, its own kind of language. She ate everything on her plate and part of the cornbread he hadn't touched, and he noticed that she ate with the particular attention of someone reacquainting themselves with the concept of enough food. He pushed the remaining cornbread toward her. She looked at the cornbread. She looked at him. She took it. That was the end of supper. 3 days passed, then a week. Seraphine settled into the ranch the way water settles into dry ground, quietly, completely, without announcement. She was up before Coulter most mornings, which he discovered when he came downstairs the second day to find her already in the barn, measuring out hay with the confidence of someone who had been doing exactly this in exactly this barn for years. The mare, who Seraphine had started calling something in her own private language, a short motion of her right hand that Coulter had started mentally translating as the red one, though he couldn't have explained why, was already looking better, standing easier, eating. "How'd you know where the feed was kept?" he asked, because he was genuinely curious. She was looking at the mare. She couldn't hear him. He made a mental note. When you want to talk to her, you need to be in her line of sight. He was going to have to learn that. He could see that clearly. He didn't have opinions about learning things. Learning things was how you stayed functional. The first week's friction wasn't dramatic. It was the small, inevitable friction of two people occupying the same space who had no shared language and no shared history. She moved through his kitchen with total confidence in her own systems, which did not match his systems, and he would find jars in different places, and the firewood stacked differently, and his good knife relocated to a more sensible position. He admitted, grudgingly, that it was a more sensible position than where he'd been keeping it. He tried a few times to explain his preferences. He'd stand in her field of vision and gesture at whatever had been moved and gesture at where it had been, and she would watch him with that careful, serious attention she brought to everything. And then she would make a motion with her hands, some counter-argument in a language he didn't speak, and move on. He won maybe a third of these encounters. He found he was surprisingly accepting of losing the other 2/3. On the 9th day, she found his whiskey. He kept a bottle in the bottom of the pantry behind a sack of rice in the particular location of a man who was trying to make a habit slightly less convenient. He didn't drink much, 2, maybe 3 glasses a week, winter evenings when the quiet of the house became the kind of quiet that had weight. He considered it a reasonable accommodation to a hard life and didn't examine it further. He came into the kitchen on the 9th night to find Seraphine at the kitchen table, the whiskey bottle in front of her and her hands pressed flat on the table on either side of it. She was not drinking. She was looking at the bottle with the expression of someone who had recognized something. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up at him. Her eyes were not accusatory. They were something harder to name, a kind of knowledge that had been won rather than learned. He sat down across from her. He reached out and took the bottle. He thought about it. He set it off to the side of the table, out of the center, not hidden, but not featured. She watched him do this. He looked back at her. She reached across the table and moved the bottle from the side of the table to the windowsill behind her, where it was technically still in the room but was now facing the other direction, visible only if you turned around and looked for it. He stared at the bottle's back. Then he looked at her. She raised her eyebrows, a very specific expression, one he was beginning to recognize as her version of well. He made a sound in his chest that might, under more favorable circumstances, have been a laugh. He got up and put the bottle in the pantry, behind the rice. She nodded once. Approval, or at least not disapproval. Neither of them acknowledged that this had happened. They went to their respective rooms. But something had shifted. He could feel it without being able to name it. Something in the house was different from what it had been the day before. 2 weeks in, the weather turned. Not dramatically. This was Texas November, not a dime novel. The cold came in the way it usually did, incremental and honest, with the first real frost arriving on a Tuesday morning as Coulter was checking the east pasture fence. The posts that needed resetting were worse than he'd thought. He came back to the barn with cold hands and worse mood and found Seraphine in the barn doorway. She was looking at the sky, not watching it, reading it, eyes moving slowly across the cloud formations to the northwest, the way an experienced rider reads a horse's movements. Her brow was creased. Her hands were still. She turned when she heard his boots in the mud and held up one finger, then pointed to the north, then held up both hands flat, palms down, and moved them apart from each other, spreading, expanding. He looked at the northern sky. Standard gray, nothing remarkable. "Storm?" he asked, pointing north. She nodded, one emphatic dip of her chin. "Today?" She held up two fingers, then pointed up and then down, morning to night. 2 days. He looked north again. Nothing. The sky was flat and unremarkable and gave no indication of anything particular, but he had a 2-day window to prepare, and preparation was something he was good at. He spent the next morning and a half reinforcing the barn, checking the woodpile, bringing the 2 youngest horses in from the far pasture. On the second evening, the sky started doing something in the northwest. A pressure change, a darkening at the edges, the kind of thing you could feel in your back teeth if you knew what to pay attention to. By midnight, the storm hit like it had been personally offended by something. He sat up in the kitchen with a lamp and a cup of coffee going stale, listening to the wind throw itself against the house, and thought, "She knew 2 days before I could see anything." He didn't say that out loud. There was nobody to say it to. But he thought it. The day the town came to the ranch, it was a Saturday. He'd been expecting something like it. The county was not large, and $60 passing hands for a mute girl at auction was not the kind of thing that went undiscussed. He'd been in town twice since bringing Seraphine home, and both times he'd felt the shape of what was coming in the too careful greetings and the questions that stopped one step short of being direct. "How's that girl working out? Heard she's been helping with your stock." "People say some strange things, Hayes. Don't mean nothing by it." It was a Saturday morning when he saw the horses on the road from the kitchen window. 6 of them. He recognized Roy Mabry's gray quarter horse in the front, which told him Roy Mabry was leading this particular errand, which told him the errand was going to be delivered with at least the performance of reasonableness. Roy Mabry considered himself a reasonable man. He was, at minimum, a man who liked to believe his own story. Coulter walked to the back room and knocked on the doorframe. Seraphine was at the window already. She'd seen the horses before he had, or felt the vibration of their hooves in the earth, or some combination of both. She was watching the road with that flat, still expression he now associated with her at her most careful. He stepped into her line of sight, pointed toward the front of the house. She looked at him. He touched his own chest, then gestured toward the front. "I'll handle it." She held his gaze for a moment, reading him the same way she'd read that storm sky. Then she gave him one small nod. He went to the front porch. Roy Mabry pulled up in the yard with 5 other men behind him. Coulter recognized most of them, had bought feed from some, had exchanged work with others during branding season. They were neighbors, in the loose definition the frontier allowed. They were not at this moment acting like neighbors. "Coulter." Roy pulled his hat brim down in a gesture that combined greeting with authority poorly. "Nice morning." "Roy, we wanted to come out and have a conversation." "You're having one." Roy glanced back at the men behind him, presumably for support, then back to Coulter. "Look, I'll say what I mean. People are talking about that girl you brought home. There's things being said. Strange things, Coulter, things I wouldn't normally lend my ear to, but there are enough people saying them that I think a man in your position ought to consider what you're doing." Coulter leaned one shoulder against the porch post. "What kinds of things?" "She's not—" Roy stopped, adjusted his approach. "People say she knows things she shouldn't, predicts weather, knew about Caleb Drummond's cattle getting sick before Caleb did. Mrs. Hartfield swears the girl stood outside her house last week and looked at her door for 10 minutes like she was waiting for something, and 20 minutes later Hartfield's youngest had a fever." "Did the girl try to help with the fever?" A pause. Yes, she brought some herbs or something." "And did the child recover?" Roy's jaw tightened. "That's not—" "Coulter, that ain't the point." "Then what is the point, Roy?" The man on Roy's left, Abel Deere, who ran a small cattle operation along the creek, spoke up. He was not a reasonable performance man. He was the kind of man who said what the room was thinking before the room was ready to hear it. "The point is she ain't right, and having something that ain't right living on your property means that your property ain't right, and by extension—" "She's not a thing," Coulter said. The porch went quiet. He hadn't raised his voice. He almost never raised his voice. But there was something in the flatness of it that was, people generally found, more unnerving than shouting. "She's a woman," he continued. "She can't hear and she doesn't talk. Those are the only things about her that are different from you or me, and neither one of them is a crime or a curse or anything else you've decided to make it." "She knew about that storm," Roy said, quieter now. "Told you 2 days early, way I heard it. She read the sky. Some people can do that. Nobody reads a sky 2 days out like that." "She does." He met Roy's eyes. "And I'm grateful for it. Saved me a lot of trouble." Roy Mabry sat on his horse for a long moment, looking at Coulter with the expression of a man recalculating what he thought he knew. Behind him, his 5 companions shuffled and were quiet. "I'm asking you," Roy said finally more carefully, "to consider what you're doing. For your own sake, people are—" "I know what people are," Coulter said. "I've known people my whole life. They make up their minds before they look, and then they find evidence for what they've already decided. I don't hold it against them personally, but I'm not going to run her off because they're scared of something they don't understand." Another silence. "She's welcome here," Coulter said. "That's not changing. Now, unless you've got something else to discuss, I've got fence to work." Roy held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned his horse. The others followed. No goodbyes. Just horses and mud, and the sound of them diminishing down the road. Coulter stood on the porch and watched them go. He heard a sound behind him. The door, opening slightly. He turned. Seraphine stood in the doorway, shawl around her shoulders, watching the retreating horses. Then she looked at him. He held her gaze. She stepped forward and stood beside him on the porch, watching the road, close enough that her shoulder was near his arm. Not touching. Near. They stood there together until the horses were gone from sight. He didn't know if she'd understood what was said. Some of it, maybe. Enough to get the shape of it. But she stood there with him, and that was its own kind of answer. November deepened into something hard and cold. Coulter spent the days doing what the season required, checking fences, preparing equipment for winter storage, monitoring the feed supplies he'd calculated out to last through March. He had a system. He trusted his system. He had built his life around systems because systems did not leave, did not disappoint, did not look at you with anything that could be taken away. He had not planned on the way the house felt different now. There was coffee in the morning that he hadn't made because Seraphine was up first. There was the smell of something edible at midday because she had located, identified, and deployed the dried herbs hanging in the pantry that he had bought at the trading post in September and entirely forgotten about. There were small repairs, a split in the kitchen window caulking, a door hinge that squealed, that simply stopped being problems without anyone announcing they'd been addressed. The horses were all doing better. This was empirical fact. He kept records, grain consumption, weight estimates, general condition notes in a small ledger. He compared the October entries to the November entries. Every animal was measurably better. He hadn't changed anything in his care routine. She had. He watched her with the animals when he could without being intrusive about it, and he tried to understand what she was doing differently. The best he could figure was that she did nothing dramatically different. She just paid more attention. Stayed longer. Let the animals set the pace instead of imposing one. Let silence do things that most people tried to do with words. He found that observation useful in ways that went beyond horses. She started teaching him. It happened gradually, the way most things happened between them, without announcement, without planning, as a natural extension of spending time in the same space. He first noticed it on a November evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, when she set a piece of paper on the table between them and drew 2 hands. Then she arranged her own hands in the configuration she'd drawn and looked at him. He copied the shape with his own hands. Badly. She corrected his fingers with both her hands. Matter of fact, impersonal, like correcting a tool's grip. And then pointed at the drawing and made the sign. He tried again. Better. She nodded. Not enthusiastically, competently. She added a second sign. A third. These early ones were simple. Yes, no, water, fire, horse, more. And he was a slow student by his own assessment, hampered by hands that had spent 4 decades being used for work rather than language. His fingers were not built for this kind of precision, and they communicated their reluctance. She was patient. not in a soft, accommodating way. In the way of someone who has decided a thing will be accomplished and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. He would come to associate that particular quality of patience with her more than any other. The patience of someone who knew that time spent waiting on someone's readiness was not time wasted. By the fourth week, he could hold a rudimentary conversation, not a sophisticated one, not a conversation about philosophy or weather patterns or the things he thought about in the sleepless hours before 3 in the morning. A conversation about what needs doing today, and the red mare is limping on her left rear, and are you cold, and yes and no, and I don't know. But they were building something. He could feel it. The same way he'd been able to feel years ago, when the foundation of the house was going in right. A specific rightness, structural, solid, not dependent on whether you were having a good day or paying close attention. Just there, whether you noticed it or not. Some evenings he caught himself paying attention to the way the lamp threw her shadow on the kitchen wall, to the way her hands moved when she thought she was unobserved, to the specific quality of the silence between them, which was no longer the silence of two strangers in a small house, but something else. Something that had been shaped by their time together into a specific form. He was careful with what he did with that observation. He had been married once. He had loved his wife with the full, unguarded capability of a young man who had not yet learned what loving someone fully could cost you. When she died, fever, 4 years ago, 23 days from the first symptom to the end, he had conducted himself through the grief with the same systematic precision he brought to everything else. And he had mostly succeeded, and he had not let anyone close enough to risk that particular kind of loss again. He was not going to be careless with a woman who had no safe alternative to the roof he'd provided. He knew that. He was not that kind of man, but the observation stayed. The last week of November brought its own kind of reckoning. He'd ridden into town for supplies, something he did every 3 weeks with the grim efficiency of a man who preferred his own company but acknowledged the necessity of commerce. He got what he needed, loaded the wagon, was heading back when he stopped at the post office and found 2 letters he'd been expecting and one he hadn't. The unexpected letter was from Deke Sutter. He sat in the wagon and read it once and then read it again and then folded it up and put it in his coat pocket. The gist of it was brief and ugly. Deke had decided the $60 was insufficient for what he'd sold. He wanted more. He framed it as a legal question, some half-formed claim that the transaction hadn't been properly documented, but the meaning underneath the legal framing was clear enough. He hadn't told Seraphine. There was no clean way to tell her. He sat in the wagon for a while longer, looking at the general store's awning, the muddy street, the townspeople moving in and out of their ordinary days. A woman with a child on her hip, 2 boys running, the blacksmith hammering at something in the open front of his shop, a man without much, a ranch that was manageable rather than prosperous, a woman in his spare room who had remade the atmosphere of his home in 4 weeks more thoroughly than he had managed in 4 years. He put the wagon in motion. He didn't have an answer to Deke Sutter's letter yet, but he knew what the answer wasn't. The answer wasn't giving up and letting Deke have whatever he wanted. He knew that with the same certainty as he knew the frost schedule and the hay requirements and which fence posts needed replacing. Some things you just knew. He got home at dusk, drove the wagon to the barn, began unloading. The evening was cold and still, that particular frozen stillness that comes before snow. Seraphine appeared at the barn door. She looked at him. Something in his face told her something because she went still with that specific quality of stillness, not passive but gathered, alert. He set down the grain sack he was carrying and turned to face her fully. He made the sign for problem. One of the early signs she'd taught him, because he was a man who encountered problems regularly and needed vocabulary for them. She waited. He made the sign for man. She'd taught him several signs for people, and he used the one associated with difficulty. Then he made the sign for coming here. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but he watched her eyes sharpen. He spread his hands. I will handle it. She looked at him for a long beat. Then she put her hand flat on her own chest and raised her eyebrows. Me too. He held her gaze. Together, her look said, without any sign for it, just the quality of her presence in the doorway, immovable, clear. He picked up the grain sack again. "All right," he said out loud, to the cold air, to the barn, to her. She stepped aside to let him through and followed him in. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, thin and quiet, on the Texas plains. The snow didn't last. It never did, this early in the season. 2 inches on the ground by morning, gone by afternoon, leaving behind mud that was somehow worse than what came before it. Texas winter was like that, uncommitted. It threatened and then retreated and then came back harder when you'd started to believe it had changed its mind. Coulter read Deke Sutter's letter a third time over his morning coffee and then burned it in the stove. Not because burning it solved anything, he knew that, but there was something clarifying about fire, about the decision it represented. This particular piece of paper, this particular set of demands, reduced to nothing while the coffee went cold. He'd write back to Deke in his own time, in his own terms. He'd already spent most of the night working out what those terms would be, lying awake and staring at the ceiling with the specific focus of a man who processes difficult things through exhaustive mental rehearsal rather than sleep. The conclusion he'd arrived at, somewhere around 2 in the morning, was simple. Deke Sutter had sold something he didn't have the right to sell in the first place, and his claim to additional compensation was built on nothing but the belief that Coulter Hayes would find it easier to pay than to fight. Deke believed that because Deke had spent his life finding out which people would bend rather than push back, and he had a good instinct for it, and he'd been mostly right about most people. He was wrong about this one. Coulter poured the cold coffee out and made fresh. Seraphine came downstairs while he was on his second cup. She was dressed, hair already pinned back though imperfectly, several strands loose at her neck in a way that was more functional than careless. She went directly to the window and looked at the yard, and then at the sky. And then she turned and made the sign for cold, followed by something he didn't recognize yet, her hands describing a slow, arching motion. He frowned at the motion. "I don't know that one." She repeated it, pointed outside, made the sign for horse. "Something about the horses in the cold?" She shook her head, made the sign for wait, then the arching motion again, slower, her hands sweeping from left to right. He watched her hands and thought about what an arch from left to right might mean in terms of weather or animals or the morning outside, and it came to him the way most things came to him, not as inspiration but as logic arriving at its end point. The temperature's going to swing back. Warm spell coming? One decisive nod. Today? She held up 2 fingers. 2 days. He looked out at the flat white sky. There was nothing there that said warm spell to him. But there had been nothing in the sky 2 days before the November storm either, and the storm had come precisely when she said it would, and hit precisely as hard as he'd scrambled to prepare for. He added warm swing in 2 days to the back of his ledger page with the date. He'd been doing this for 3 weeks now, writing down her predictions and then recording the outcomes. The results were making him deeply thoughtful about things he'd previously considered superstition. He slid the ledger back across the table toward her and pointed to the entry. She looked at it, then at him, a question in her eyes. He touched the page. "I keep track," he said, and when she didn't respond to the words, he pointed to the ledger, then to his temple, then drew a line with his finger from his temple to the page. She understood. He could tell by the slight change in her expression, not surprise, but something that might have been the bare softening. She looked at the ledger again, at the column of dates and predictions and outcomes, and was quiet in a way that felt heavier than her usual quiet. He didn't know what she made of it. He wasn't sure he could afford to guess. The morning got to work on them, the way mornings did. The 2 days passed, and on the third morning, Coulter woke to air that was loose and mild and smelled of wet cedar, and the temperature had come up 14 degrees overnight, and everything in the yard was dripping. He stood on the porch with his boots half-laced and stared at the thermometer, and then at his ledger entry, and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that wasn't already written in the numbers. He had 17 such entries now. 17 for 17. He'd been a man of systems his whole life. He believed in patterns, in evidence, in the things that could be measured and recorded and trusted. He did not, as a rule, believe in things he couldn't explain, but he was also honest enough to know that can't explain and doesn't exist were not the same category, and that a man who threw out reliable data because it made him uncomfortable was not actually a man of evidence at all. Whatever Seraphine was doing, Whether she was reading something in the air or the soil or some sense he simply didn't have, she was doing it consistently and she was doing it right. That was the beginning and the end of his analysis. The rest was other people's problem. And other people were making it a problem, incrementally, the way erosion makes a problem. Slow and quiet, until one day the ground gives way. The talk in town had changed texture. He could feel it every time he rode in, the way you can feel a change in a room you've walked into 100 times when someone's moved the furniture 2 inches. Nothing dramatic, just different. Eyes that dropped a half-second too late. Conversations that had a shape to them that suggested they'd been a different shape before he walked in. Rufus Hale, who ran the mercantile, was the first one to say anything direct. He did it the way men like Rufus always did. Under the cover of concern, wrapped in friendship, delivered with the particular earnestness of someone who had decided in advance that their intention was good, and therefore whatever followed was justified. "People are saying she knew about the Granger boy," Rufus said, bagging Coulter's flour. "That she was seen standing outside the Granger place the night before the boy took sick." Was she? It wasn't a question. She wasn't inside, just standing, looking at the house. Rufus tied the bag. "People find that unsettling, Coulter. You can understand that." "I can understand it," Coulter said. "I don't agree with it." "What you think she was doing out there?" Coulter picked up the flour bag. "She might have felt something. She senses things. I don't know how, and I don't think it matters particularly." He set it in the crate with the rest. "If she knew something was wrong, why does it matter how she knew it?" Rufus was quiet for a moment. "Because people need to understand how things work, Hayes. When something can't be explained, they get scared. And scared people do stupid things," Coulter finished. "Yeah, I know." He paid for the supplies and left. But Rufus's words stayed with him on the drive home in the specific way that an accurate thing you don't want to agree with stays, like a stone in your boot that you keep deciding to deal with later. Scared people did stupid things. He knew that was true. He'd seen it enough times in enough contexts to have cataloged it as reliable. Fear made people need a target, and a target that couldn't argue back was the easiest kind. Seraphine couldn't argue back. She couldn't defend herself in the language the town used. He thought about that for the length of the drive home and had the low, cold understanding that Roy Mabry and his horses had been only the beginning of something, not the end of it. He pulled up to the barn and she was there, as she often was when he returned, not waiting exactly but present. She took the mare's lead while he unloaded. He stopped with a feed sack in his arms and looked at her. She was checking the mare's left rear leg, the one that had been bothering the animal for a week, with her hands, working from the hock down with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. The mare stood quiet under it. "You were at the Granger place," he said. She looked up at him, read his face, or his lips, or both. He set down the feed sack and made the signs for town and Granger. He'd learned the name sign she used for several families by now. And then "see you, stand outside, night." Her expression didn't shift with guilt. It shifted with something more complicated. The look of someone weighing how much of an explanation was going to translate. She made a sign he knew, feel, then one he'd seen her use before but didn't have a precise translation for. Her hand spreading outward from her chest, like something radiating. He thought about it. "You felt something wrong, coming from that direction." "Yes." Then, "Child, sick." "You knew the boy was sick before it showed." "Yes." Then, "Careful, deliberate. I did not go inside." "I know." She held his gaze. There was something tight in her face, some quality of controlled frustration. The expression of someone who has had to justify themselves repeatedly for things they didn't choose. He thought about what to say. He thought about whether the right thing was to tell her to be careful, to stay on the property, to not give the town more fuel. He thought about how those words would land in the face of someone who had probably been told to make herself smaller and less visible her entire life. "The Granger boy," he said. "Is he going to be all right?" She tilted her head, made the sign for if, then held up one hand, then the other. A weighing motion. 2 possibilities. If someone helps him in time? Yes. "Do you know what's wrong with him?" She hesitated. Then she made several signs he didn't know, and seeing his confusion, she went to the grain room and came back with a short stick and scratched 3 letters in the dirt floor of the barn. FVR. Fever. He looked at the letters. What kind? She scratched more. Lung. He stood with that for a moment. The Granger boy was 7 years old. Lung fever in a child that size, in November, with the nearest doctor, a barely adequate man named Pruitt, who spent more time riding between 3 counties than actually treating anyone, days away. He looked at her. Can you help him? She met his eyes. If they let me. The emphasis was clear even through signs. He rubbed the back of his neck. He thought about Rufus Hale and Roy Mabry and the shape of conversations in the Mercantile. He thought about scared people and easy targets. I'll go with you, he said. She blinked. Something moved through her expression that was harder to read than her usual transparency. Surprise, maybe. Or the careful, suspicious version of hope that develops in people who've been surprised badly before. She signed slowly. Why? He picked up the feed sack again. Because nobody's going to listen to a woman who can't talk to them. But they might listen to me. He carried the feed into the grain room and came back. She was still standing in the same spot, watching him. Tomorrow morning, he said, if you think there's still time. She held up one finger. Morning will be the edge of it. Then tomorrow morning. They didn't discuss it again that evening. But something had settled between them that had the quality of a decision, solid and complete, and over supper, beans again, because November was not a month for imagination. The silence had a different weight than it had carried even the week before. He washed the dishes. She dried them, which was a division of labor they had arrived at without negotiation, the way most of their arrangements arrived, through proximity and mutual practicality. He handed her a bowl. She dried it and set it on the shelf in the position she preferred, which was not the position he'd been keeping it in, and which was admittedly more logical. He handed her another bowl. She caught his eyes, made the sign for thank you, a clean, decisive motion. He didn't know, entirely, what she was thanking him for. The bowl, maybe, or the morning's plan, or something larger that neither of them had the language for yet. He gave her a single nod and handed her the last cup. The next morning they rode to the Granger place together, Coulter on his gelding and Seraphine on the red mare, who was moving well enough for the distance. The Granger homestead was 4 miles east, a small operation, corn and a few cattle, run by a man named Warren Granger, who had moved from Arkansas 6 years ago with his wife Clara and accumulated 3 children in the process. Coulter knew Warren slightly, enough to nod at, enough to know he was a stubborn, careful man who loved his family in the practical way that frontier men loved things, through labor and maintenance and showing up. Warren met them in the yard before they reached the porch. He looked at Coulter. He looked at Seraphine. His face did the thing faces did, the calculation, the recognition, the uncertainty. Hayes, his voice was careful. Warren, I heard the boy's sick. He's got a fever. Pruitt's been sent for. Pruitt's 3 days out minimum. Coulter kept his voice even. She's good with illness. I've seen it. I'm asking you to let her look at him. Warren's eyes went to Seraphine again. She was looking at the house, her face composed and waiting, not pushing, just present. She's the one people are... Warren stopped. Yes, Coulter said. A silence that stretched. From inside the house, they could hear it. The specific, ragged quality of a child's breathing that was doing more work than it should. Coulter watched Warren hear it, watched the man's face do the math that parents do, the terrible arithmetic of available options. Warren stepped back from the doorway. Seraphine was off the mare before Coulter had fully processed that they'd been given permission. She moved to the porch steps and paused, looked back at Warren with a question in her posture. Front room, Warren said roughly. On the cot. She went inside. Coulter dismounted and tied both horses to the rail. He stood in the yard with Warren and listened to the silence from inside. Not anxious silence, but working silence, the sound of something being done with attention. After a long moment, Warren said, She really predict weather? 17 times. I've got it written down. Another silence. People say, I know what people say. Coulter turned to face the other man. Warren, your boy's breathing sounds like wet paper. You can wait for Pruitt, or you can let her work. Warren stared at the house for a long time. Then he went inside. Coulter waited in the yard. An hour passed, maybe more. The morning warmed around him, Seraphine's warm swing 2 days out, arriving on schedule. He heard at various intervals Clara Granger's voice, low and urgent, and once a sound from the boy that tightened something in his chest, and then quiet. Then Warren appeared in the doorway. His face was different. The calculation was gone. What was there instead was the face of a man who had been relieved of something very heavy by something he didn't fully understand and wasn't sure he needed to. "Fever broke," Warren said. Coulter let out a breath. She made him breathe something. Steam with herbs in it. I don't know what kind. Kept his chest clear. Warren rubbed his face with one hand. Pruitt probably would have done something similar. Probably, Coulter agreed. What she is, Warren started, stopped, tried again. What she does. Where does it come from? Coulter thought about 17 weather predictions and a horse that calmed in 30 seconds and a 7-year-old boy breathing easier in a cot. He thought about what he actually knew, which was that he didn't know the mechanism, only the results. I don't know, he said honestly. Does it matter? Warren thought about it for a real moment, not a performative one. I suppose I don't know either. Seraphine appeared in the doorway behind Warren. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hands damp from the steamwork, and she looked tired. Genuinely tired, not the polite version of it. This had cost her something. He could see that. She looked at Warren, made a gesture toward the house. Slow, careful. Then she made several signs that Coulter didn't fully follow, but he caught rest in 3 days in water, warm. She's saying keep him resting. 3 days minimum, warm liquids, Coulter translated. Warren nodded. He looked at Seraphine with an expression that was working its way toward something that might, eventually, become gratitude. It wasn't there yet, but it was moving in that direction. Thank you, he said to her, stiff but sincere. She gave him one nod, unrolled her sleeves. On the ride back, Coulter looked over at her once and found her looking at the sky with that particular expression she got when she was reading something. Steady, absorbed, a little elsewhere. You all right? He asked. She glanced at him. He repeated it in signs. She considered the question for a moment, which was something he'd come to appreciate. She never answered quickly just to have an answer. Then she made a sign he knew and one he didn't, better. And then one hand over her chest, pressing lightly. He thought better in here was probably the right translation. He turned back to the road. They rode the rest of the way in silence, which was by now not really silence at all, just the particular medium they used for things that didn't need words. The Granger boy recovered fully. Within a week, the story had moved through the county the way stories move, imprecisely, selectively, shaped by each mouth that carried it. Some version of it reached every homestead, every saloon, every Sunday gathering. The details shifted. The meaning shifted less. A woman who couldn't speak had known a child was sick before the child showed symptoms. She had treated him, and he had recovered. The whispers didn't stop. They didn't stop for a long time, but they changed just slightly in tone. The way a note changes when you hold it long enough, moving from sharp to something more uncertain, something that hadn't yet decided what it was. Coulter noticed the change. He didn't say anything about it. He wrote Deke Sutter his reply. 3 sentences, firm, leaving no opening for negotiation, and sent it with the Thursday Post rider. Then he went home and fed the horses and fixed the middle drawer of Seraphine's chest of drawers, because he'd been meaning to do that for 3 weeks and it was past time. She found him at it when she came in from the barn. She stood in the doorway of the spare room and looked at him kneeling in front of the open drawer with a plane and a block of wax. He didn't look up. Stuck, he said, then signed it. She leaned in the doorway and watched him work. He could feel her watching. After a moment, she pushed off the doorframe and left, and came back 2 minutes later with a cup of coffee that she set on the floor beside him and then left again without comment. He finished the drawer. It slid clean. He tested it twice. He drank the coffee, which was hot and stronger than he made it, and thought that this specific unremarkable moment, the fixed drawer and the too strong coffee and the spare room that was hers, now, in a way, spare rooms were never really anyone's, this was the thing he hadn't expected. Not the weather predictions or the horse calming or the sick boy recovering. This, the ordinary accumulation of it. The way the house had become, without announcement or ceremony, a place where 2 people lived instead of 1. He picked up his tools. Outside, the warm spell Seraphine had promised was holding, and the light through the window had that particular late autumn gold to it, the kind that didn't last, that was already carrying in it the knowledge of its own ending. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment before he left it, coffee cup in hand, looking at the window, at the light. He went back to work. Deke Sutter's reply came back in 10 days. It was shorter than his first letter and uglier, which Coulter had expected. The legal framing was gone. Apparently Deke had consulted someone with enough knowledge to tell him it wouldn't hold, and what remained was the stripped-down version, a threat wearing the clothes of a grievance. Deke would come to the ranch, Deke would bring men, Deke would take back what was his, since Coulter clearly didn't understand the value of what he'd purchased. Coulter read it twice. Then he set it on the kitchen table under his coffee cup and went out to split wood because splitting wood was what he did when he needed to think without appearing to think. He worked through a cord and a half before he came back inside. Seraphine had found the letter. She was sitting at the table when he came in, the letter in her hands, reading it with the focused attention she brought to any written thing. She had learned to read, he'd discovered early on, better than he'd expected and perhaps better than most people in the county, though nobody had thought to ask. She looked up when he came through the door, and her expression was not the controlled, careful expression she wore for most things. It was tight. It was angry. It was the face of someone who had been a subject of other people's transactions for long enough to recognize the shape of it immediately and hate it immediately. She set the letter down on the table, looked at him. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. His hands were rough from the wood, slightly red from the cold. He folded them on the table. "He's not going to get what he wants," Coulter said. She made the sign for how. He'd been working on that exact question for a cord and a half of firewood. "I can go to the county seat, file a proper record of the sale, make it legal in a way that Deke can't argue with after the fact." She absorbed that. Then, time. 2 days' ride? 3 if the roads are bad. He comes before. Possibly. He met her eyes. But the county seat puts this on record regardless of what Deke does in the meantime. Means any action he takes is on the wrong side of documented law, not just on the wrong side of my word against his. She looked at the letter, looked at the table. He could see her working through it. Not the emotional weight of it, which she'd already processed and set aside with a practicality he'd come to admire, but the logistics, the angles. She looked up and made a sign he knew. Ranch. And then one he'd recently learned. Alone. "You'd be here alone," he said. "Yeah." "For 3 days." "Yes." He looked at the table too. He'd thought about this during the wood splitting. He'd thought about leaving her here. 3 days. With a man like Deke potentially coming and no one to back her. He'd also thought about what happened if he didn't file the record, if he stayed and Deke came. And this became a confrontation on uncertain legal ground where Coulter's claim to the situation was verbal and handshake at an auction where nobody had proper authority over anything. "I could go to Millard," he said. "He's the closest thing we've got to a proper sheriff." She made the sign for Millard. She had her own name signs for most of the county's prominent figures, efficient and often slightly editorial, and then the sign for Slow. He almost smiled at that, because Millard was in fact an extremely slow-moving man in all senses, but it was also accurate that relying on him was relying on something porous. He drummed his fingers once on the table. "I don't want to leave you for 3 days." She looked at him steadily. She signed, "I have been alone before." He knew that. He also knew that before and now were different categories, and that what had changed between them over the past 7 weeks was not a small thing, even if neither of them had named it. "I know," he said. She tilted her head slightly. Something in his voice, or his face, had told her something, because she held his gaze for a moment with a different quality of attention than the practical, logistical kind. Then she reached across the table and put her hand on his. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just her hand on his, for the length of a breath. She took it back. He looked at the place on his hand where hers had been, and then at the letter, and then at the window where December was doing its gray and non-committal thing. "I'll go tomorrow," he said. "I'll ask Roy Mabry to check on the property while I'm out. He owes me a decent turn." She nodded. Practical. Then, "I will be here." "I know you will," he said. He rode out at first light. The county seat was 2 days at a reasonable pace. He pushed slightly and made it in a day and 3/4, arrived at dusk, found the records office closed and the clerk gone home, and spent the night in a boarding house that smelled of mildew and someone else's history. He filed the paperwork the next morning. The clerk, a thin man named Ashby with the permanent expression of someone who had seen too many disputes over property and livestock, took Coulter's documentation without particular interest and stamped it with the slow ceremony of a man who understood that his stamp was the important part. "Sale registered," Ashby said. $60, one mare, one... He paused at the description. "One individual of the female sex, named Seraphine, no family name on record." "That's right," Ashby stamped again. "Any party disputing this transaction will need to appear before Judge Carver, who is scheduled for this circuit in March." "March," Coulter repeated. "March," Ashby confirmed, with the sympathy of a man who knew March was a long way off. Coulter took his copy of the stamped record and folded it carefully into his breast pocket, close to his chest, and rode home harder than he'd ridden in years. He made it back on the afternoon of the third day. The ranch was standing, the animals were fed, and the barn was in order and the house was warm, smoke rising from the chimney in the particular way that meant the firebox had been properly loaded and not just thrown at. Roy Mabry's horse was not in the yard, which meant Roy had either come and gone or not come at all. And Coulter found he didn't particularly care which, because the ranch was clearly fine. Seraphine was in the barn when he rode in. She was working on the red mare's hooves, routine maintenance, something he normally did himself on Tuesdays, and she looked up when the barn door opened with the same expression she always had, attentive, reading him before he said anything. He held up the folded document from his breast pocket. She set down the hoof tool, looked at the paper. He crossed the barn and held it out to her. She took it and unfolded it carefully and read it with the same focused attention she'd given Deke's letter, though the expression on her face was categorically different. She read it once and then again. Then she folded it back along its creases and handed it to him and made the sign he'd learned early, the one she used for something being correct, being right, being what it should be. She used it precisely and without excess. He took the document back and returned it to his breast pocket. "Deke come?" he asked. She shook her head. "No." "Roy Mabry?" She made her editorial name sign for Roy and then tilted her hand side to side, once, briefly, and then made a motion he took to mean he'd looked at the fence lines and ridden on, which was Roy doing the minimum, which was Roy. "All right," Coulter said. She picked up the hoof tool and went back to the mare. He unsaddled his gelding and began the end-of-ride routine, brush, water, check legs, and they worked in the same space with the easy parallel quiet that had by now become entirely natural. Two people who had learned to occupy shared space without filling it unnecessarily. After a while, without planning to, he said, "Cold in town." She couldn't hear it. He knew that. He said it anyway. The month turned into December. December on the Texas plains had a specific personality. Not the dramatic, cinematic cold of places further north, but a mean, low cold that got into things, into hinges and door frames and the joints of anyone over 35. Coulter felt it in his right shoulder where he'd taken a bad fall 10 years ago, and the bone had healed slightly wrong. And he didn't mention it because there was nothing to be done about it, and mentioning things you couldn't fix was a waste of everyone's time. Seraphine noticed anyway. He became aware of it one evening when he reached for the coffee pot and made a motion slightly wrong, favoring the shoulder without thinking. And she was watching from across the kitchen, and her expression shifted in that specific way of someone who has filed information. He didn't think more about it. The next morning, there was a small cloth packet on the kitchen table, tied with a strip of fabric, sitting next to his coffee cup. He picked it up and smelled it, something herbal and sharp, a combination he didn't recognize. He looked at her. She was at the stove with her back to him. He waited until she turned and then pointed at the packet. She pointed at his right shoulder. He looked at the packet, looked at his shoulder. "Heat it?" he asked, mimicking the motion of applying something warm. She shook her head, made the sign for inside, touching her own chest, and then mimed drinking. "It's for drinking," he said. "Yes." He examined the packet. "What's in it?" She went to the counter and came back with a small piece of paper and a pencil. She kept these in a pocket, he'd noticed, more consistently than anything else, and wrote 3 words he could mostly read and one he couldn't. He could make out willow and ginger and what might have been yarrow. The fourth word he couldn't parse. He looked at her. She pointed to her shoulder again and then made the sign for fire. Gone. His vocabulary was adequate enough by now that he caught inflammation. Anti-inflammatory, he said. She held up a finger. Close enough. He made the tea. It tasted like something that had made bad decisions in a previous life, but he drank it because she was watching him with the expression of a woman who would absolutely notice if he poured it out. By the following evening, the shoulder was measurably better. Not gone. The structural problem was 39 years old and not going anywhere, but quieter. He didn't say anything about it directly. He did, the next morning, move the good chair closer to the stove and leave it there, which was the chair she usually sat in for her evening reading, and the stove was warmer than the window side of the kitchen, and it was December. He told himself it was purely practical. She sat in it that evening without comment, which was also purely practical. December developed its own rhythms. The evenings were long and dark early, which meant more time inside, which meant more time at the kitchen table. Him with his ledger or his maintenance lists, her with whatever she was doing, which was various. Sometimes reading from the small collection of books on the shelf by the door, sometimes working on something with her hands, pieces of leather or fabric that were becoming something he hadn't identified yet. Sometimes she would simply sit with her back to the stove and her eyes on the middle distance and be still in a way that wasn't emptiness, but was more like a lake is still, full underneath. The signing lessons continued. He was getting better. Not fluent. He didn't think he'd ever be fluent. His hands were too old and too used to other work, but functional in a way that was growing. He could have a real conversation now, slow and imperfect, but real. He could ask what she was thinking and understand most of the answer. He could tell her something had happened in town, and she could ask him the follow-up questions, and he could answer them. He could not yet tell her most of the things that were accumulating in the part of himself he kept quiet, but he told himself that was appropriate, that those things needed to stay where they were for now. Then the storm came. He'd been watching the weather carefully since the first warm spell, keeping his own notes, comparing them to hers, learning to read alongside her rather than waiting for her translations. He had not yet caught up to her level, but he was no longer entirely illiterate. The night of the 14th, he looked at the northwest sky before bed and felt something wrong in it, a pressure quality, a specific heaviness that his growing education in Seraphine's methods told him to take seriously. He stood on the porch for a while looking at it. She appeared beside him. He pointed north. She was already looking there. He signed, "Bad?" She didn't answer immediately. She was doing the thing she did, reading, absorbing, cross-referencing whatever she felt against whatever she knew. Her hands were still. Her face was focused. Then she signed back. "Very bad. Tonight." He looked at the sky. "Tonight? How late?" She held up 2 fingers, then pointed straight up. "Midnight." He looked at the barn. "I need to check the barn door hinges. The north-facing one's been loose." "Yes," she signed. "And the—" She made a sign he didn't know, and then pointed to the roof of the house, the far left corner. "The corner eave?" "Yes." "Weak." He thought about that. He'd noticed the eave was not right, had put it on his list for spring, had not considered it urgent. He recalibrated urgency. They worked for 2 hours in the cold dark. Him with a lantern and tools, her holding the light where he needed it, and handing him things with the efficiency of someone who had watched enough repairs to understand the sequence without being told. He fixed the barn door hinges. He reinforced the eave bracket with 2 additional bolts that he had to improvise slightly, but which would hold. They came back inside a little before 10 o'clock, both of them cold and tired. He put more wood in the stove and she made something hot. Not coffee, something herbal again, milder than the shoulder remedy, just warm. They sat at the kitchen table with their cups and the lamp between them and the wind starting to pick up outside. He looked at her across the table. She was warming her hands around her cup, looking at the lamp flame, her face soft in that particular way it got when she was not in the process of doing something specific, when she was simply present. He picked up his pencil and the notepad she kept on the table and wrote something. He turned the notepad toward her. "Is this home for you?" She looked at the words. Something moved across her face. Complex, layered, the kind of expression that meant several true things at the same time and wasn't going to simplify itself for the sake of a clean answer. She picked up the pencil. She thought for a moment. She wrote, "I don't know what home felt like before, so I can't compare." He read it again. He wrote, "Is that a yes or a no?" She looked at what he'd written, and something happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, the structural beginnings of one. She wrote, "It's a yes." He looked at her handwriting, which was small and careful and entirely itself. He nodded once. Outside, the wind had graduated from suggestion to fact, picking up hard from the northwest, and the house was making its various sounds of resistance. The window frames, the door, the place on the west wall where the chinking had dried out and would need work in spring. These were familiar sounds. The house had made them before. Then there was a different sound, not a familiar one. A deep wrong creak from somewhere above and to the north, the kind of sound that a structure makes when something load-bearing is negotiating with physics, and the physics is winning. Seraphine was on her feet before the sound finished. She grabbed his arm, grabbed it with both hands, hard, no hesitation, and pulled. He was a large man, and she pulled him with the full commitment of someone who had already decided the direction and was not interested in discussion. He moved. He moved because he trusted her the way he now trusted the weather notes in his ledger. Not on faith, but on evidence, 17 times over and counting. She pulled him out of the kitchen and into the front room, and 3 seconds later there was a sound like the world splitting along a seam, a crack, and then a long, terrible crashing, and the north corner of the kitchen roof came in. Not all of it. The reinforced eave held, but the section directly over where they'd been sitting, over the table, over the lamp, over the 2 cups that were still there, caved under the weight of the accumulated ice on the roof that the storm had brought in fast and hard, and the bracket he hadn't fixed because he'd put it on the spring list. The springless bracket. He stood in the front room doorway, staring at the kitchen, with the plaster dust settling in the lamplight that somehow still burned, knocked sideways but not out, and he could hear the storm outside and feel the cold pouring through the new gap in the ceiling, and he was breathing hard. Seraphine's hands were still on his arm. He turned. She was breathing hard too. Her face was not calm. He appreciated that she wasn't performing composure. Her face was the face of someone who had run toward danger on behalf of someone else and was now processing the cost of that. Her eyes were too bright. Her hands on his arm were not loose. He covered her hands with one of his. They stood like that in the doorway while the storm moved through the house, while the kitchen filled with cold and the lamp guttered, and the ceiling said whatever it was going to say about what had happened. He didn't move his hand. She didn't move hers. He didn't have the sign for what he needed to say, and the notepad was in the kitchen under a section of ceiling plaster, so he said it out loud into the cold and the dark and the storm, knowing she couldn't hear it, saying it anyway because some things need to be said even when nobody can receive them. "You could have just run," he said. "You didn't have to come back for me." The lamp went out. In the dark, her hands were still there. They moved the bedrolls to the front room that night and kept the stove fed and waited out the storm together on opposite sides of the room in the way of 2 people who understood each other's boundaries and respected them. And the storm was still loud at 2 in the morning and quiet by 4, and sometime between 2 and 4, without deciding to, Coulter Hayes fell asleep facing a ceiling that was still intact, in a house that had held, next to someone whose hands he could still feel on his arm, even in sleep. In the morning, the kitchen was a mess of plaster and cold and broken crockery. One of the cups was unbroken. Seraphine found it under the table, rinsed it, and made coffee. She handed him the cup. He took it. That was all. That was enough. He got his tools and started on the ceiling. He fixed the kitchen ceiling in 4 days. It was not good work by his own standards. The new boards didn't match the old ones in grain or color, and there was a ridge along the patch line that he could see every time he looked up, which was often because it bothered him. He told himself he'd redo it properly in spring when the weather allowed for better lumber. He told himself this, knowing that the ridge would bother him every day until spring, and that was simply the consequence of the storm and the spring list and priorities in the wrong order. Seraphine did not appear to be bothered by the ridge. She looked at it once on the day he finished and then never looked at it again, which was either acceptance or practicality, or both. Deke Sutter's threatened visit never came. Coulter waited for it through December, stayed alert the way he stayed alert to weather and fence conditions and the other things that required monitoring. not anxiously, but consistently. He mentioned it to Roy Mabry on a cold Tuesday in town, casually, in the specific way that meant, I want this information to move. Roy was not a sophisticated man, but he understood the social mechanics of small counties, understood that certain information needed to reach certain ears through indirect routes. By Christmas, Coulter had heard through 3 separate sources that Deke Sutter had filed no claim, made no formal complaint, and had in fact taken a job driving cattle up toward Abilene, which put 200 miles between his grievances and Coulter's property. The stamped document in Coulter's breast pocket had apparently done its work before it was ever needed. The existence of a legal record had been enough. Deke was, above all things, a man who calculated odds before he acted, and odds with a stamped county record attached to them were not odds Deke liked. Coulter told Seraphine over supper. He signed it simply. Deke, gone. Bar. She looked at him across the table. Then she made one sign. Not a word exactly, but a motion she used for when something was finished, completed, resolved, clean, and final. He nodded. That was the end of Deke Sutter. What was not finished, and was in fact still working itself out through the county's various social layers, was the question of Seraphine herself. The Granger boys' recovery had changed some things, but change in a community like this was not linear. It moved sideways and backward and forward simultaneously, driven by whoever was loudest in any given room on any given day. Some people were moving toward her. Others had doubled down on their original position the way people do when they feel events are proving them wrong, with more certainty, not less, because certainty is armor, and nobody wants to stand in the cold without their armor. January arrived with the particular indifference of a month that knows it's the hardest stretch and doesn't apologize for it. The cold was real now, the committed kind, and the ranch contracted into its winter rhythms. Shorter days, longer evenings, the ongoing maintenance of animals and structures, and the small ecosystem of 2 people living in close quarters through the dark months. They had settled into something he didn't have a name for. Not friendship exactly, though there was something in it that resembled the functional trust of friendship. Not the formal arrangement of employer and helper, which had never quite fit anyway. Something that had its own particular shape, built from 7 weeks of parallel living and negotiated silences, and a kitchen ceiling that was still uneven, and a cup of coffee produced from a dark kitchen the morning after a storm. He was aware of it the way you are aware of a change in the land you've owned for years. Not dramatic, not announced, just different when you look at it straight. He did not look at it straight very often. He was, however, teaching her to ride properly. She could ride. She'd demonstrated that on the trip to the Granger place and several times since. But her riding was functional rather than skilled, the kind of competence built from necessity rather than instruction, and there were gaps in it that would matter in difficult terrain or at speed. He had opinions about horsemanship. He had opinions about most practical things. He expressed those opinions as instruction rather than criticism, which was the only kind of opinion he considered worth expressing. They worked at it on the cold mornings after chores, in the yard when the ground was solid, and in the covered end of the barn when it wasn't. He rode alongside her and watched her hands and her weight and her communication with the animal, and he corrected and demonstrated and corrected again. And she absorbed corrections with the same efficient attention she brought to everything, filing it, adjusting, trying again without defensiveness. She was good, better than she knew. Her instinct with animals translated directly into her riding once she had the technical vocabulary to match it. One morning in the 2nd week of January, something shifted. He'd been working with her on a controlled stop. The red mare had a tendency to anticipate and come in fast, which Seraphine had been accommodating rather than correcting. He'd shown her the sequence twice. On the 3rd try, she got it. Complete, clean, mare stopped exactly where and when it should have. Seraphine's weight correct, hands quiet. She looked over at him. He made the sign for good. Then, because it was actually more than good, very good. The smile she gave him then was different from the previous ones. Not the restrained, near smiles he'd gotten over the past weeks, but a full, unguarded one, the kind that reaches a person's eyes before they've decided whether to let it. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then she composed herself and turned back to the mare. He turned back to his gelding. He sat with his back very straight for the rest of the lesson. The trouble when it came from an unexpected direction. His name was Harlan Price, and he was not from Haskell County. He came through on a Tuesday in late January, heading north with a small freight operation. 3 wagons, 2 hired men, and the kind of confidence that comes from a man who has found one effective method and applied it everywhere. He stopped at the mercantile, as strangers did, and he talked to Rufus Hale, as strangers did, and what he heard in that conversation sent him out of the mercantile with an expression of specific purpose. He arrived at Coulter's ranch that afternoon. Coulter was on the porch when he saw the single horse coming up the road. No freight wagons. A personal visit then, not commerce. He waited. Price was maybe 50, well-dressed for the frontier, not rich, but careful about appearances. He pulled up at the yard fence with the ease of a man who is used to pulling up at people's yards uninvited. "You Hayes?" "I am. Got a situation you might help me with." Price looked at the ranch with assessing eyes. "Heard you've got a girl staying here. The mute one." Coulter said nothing. Price either didn't notice the quality of that silence or decided to proceed anyway. "I had a woman working for me 3 seasons back. Same type. Couldn't talk, couldn't hear. She ran off between here and Abilene about 2 years ago. I've been looking to locate her." "Why?" Price spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "She had wages owed, and I had property of hers she left behind. Just want to settle things properly." It was a smooth story. It had the shape of a reasonable story. Coulter was a man who had spent 39 years reading people in the specific way that solitary people develop, attending to the gap between what was said and how it was said. The places where a story's surface didn't quite match its structure underneath. The gap in Price's story was the word property. "What kind of property?" Coulter said. A slight pause. "Pardon?" "You said you had property of hers. What kind?" Price adjusted on his horse. "Tools. A few personal items." His eyes went to the house. "Is she here? I just need a few minutes to speak with—" He stopped. Registered something. "She can't speak, of course, but if she could write or sign, she could confirm I mean no harm." "She's not here," Coulter said. It was a lie, delivered flat, without ornamentation. Price looked at him. "I was told she was living on your property." "Whoever told you that was speculating." Coulter kept his voice entirely level. "I've got a hired hand situation that changes seasonally. If you want to check back in spring, I can tell you whether I need freight services." The commerce framing was deliberate. It gave Price a face-saving off-ramp that also happened to move him off the property. Price took it because men like Price knew when a door was closing and they preferred to walk out rather than be shown out. He touched his hat brim. "Appreciate your time." He pulled the horse around. He rode back down the road. Coulter stood on the porch until the horse was out of sight. Then he went inside. Seraphine was in the kitchen. She had been there when the rider appeared, he realized. She would have seen through the kitchen window, would have read his posture on the porch, would have understood that something was being handled. She was standing at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface and her jaw set in the way of someone who is already prepared for bad news. He came into her line of sight and signed carefully. "Man, gone. Do you know him?" Something moved across her face. She held his eyes for a moment and then looked at the table. She picked up the pencil. She wrote, "I worked for him. 1878. He was not good. He read it. He thought about property and ran off in 2 years of being looked for." He wrote, "What did he want with you then?" A long pause. Her hand was still on the pencil. He waited with the specific patience she had taught him. The patience of someone who knows that time spent waiting on readiness is not time wasted. She wrote, "Work. The kind without agreement or payment. The kind with a locked door." He put the pencil down. He stood up from the table. He walked to the window and looked out at the road where Price's horse had gone, and he stood there for a time that had no particular length. He was not a man who expressed anger through volume or movement. His anger was the quiet kind, the kind that went deep and stayed there and powered things for a long time. He had a fair amount of it right now, and he was giving it the silence it needed before he said or did anything. When he turned back, she was watching him. He sat back down. He signed. "He won't come back." She looked at him steadily. She did not sign, "How do you know?" She looked at him and waited, and the looking was its own question. "Because," he signed, and then the rest of it didn't fit in signs, so he picked up the pencil and wrote, "Because I'll make sure of it. You have a record filed with the county. You are a legal resident of this property. Any claim he makes has to go through me and then through a judge. And judges in this county don't look kindly at the kind of arrangement he's describing. He knows that. Men like him always know when the math doesn't work. She read it slowly. She wrote beneath it, smaller. You're sure? He wrote, yes. She looked at the word for a long time. Then she folded the piece of paper twice and put it in the pocket of her dress, where she kept the pencil, where she kept the things she wanted to keep. He noticed that. He didn't say anything about it. What happened next happened in February, and it was not Price. It began with a boy named Tommy Aldridge, 7 years old, who walked out of his family's homestead on a cold February morning to look at a hawk he'd seen land in the cedar breaks north of the creek, and didn't come back for supper. By the time dark fell, the Aldridge family had checked the creek, the barn, the neighbor's property, and the road in both directions. By the time full dark landed, word had spread to 6 homesteads, and a search party of 11 men was moving in and out of the cedar breaks with lanterns, calling a name into the cold that the cold gave back. Coulter heard about it around 8 o'clock from a rider passing through. He saddled up in 10 minutes. He stopped in the doorway to tell Seraphine where he was going. She was already dressed. She signed, I come. You don't have to. I come, she signed again, the exact same way, with the exact same quality of non-negotiation. He thought about the dark and the cedar breaks and the cold and what a 7-year-old boy and all of that looked like. He thought about Seraphine kneeling in a barn, knowing a child in a house 4 miles away had lung fever. He thought about 17 weather predictions in a ledger. He stepped back from the doorway. They rode together toward the cedar breaks. The search party was organized in the way that volunteer search parties in the frontier were organized, which was to say, not well. Men moving in directions they'd chosen on instinct, covering ground that other men had already covered, calling the same name in slightly different positions. Coulter arrived and recognized Roy Mabry running the effort with the best intentions and insufficient methodology. Hayes, Roy grabbed his arm. Boy's been out 3-4 hours. Temperature's dropping. We've checked the west side of the breaks twice. North side? Once. It's rougher going. Coulter looked at Seraphine. She had already dismounted and was at the edge of the search party's lantern light, crouching at the ground. She was looking at the dirt. He walked over. She didn't look up. She was reading the ground the way she read sky. Absorbed, attending to something at a level he couldn't quite access. Her lantern was low, and she tilted it at an angle to catch the surface of the soil. He crouched beside her. What do you see? She pointed. Small marks in the frozen mud. Not clear, not obvious. The kind of thing that could be anything or nothing. She traced the direction they led with one finger. North, into the rougher part of the breaks. She stood up, signed, I know where. You're sure? She looked at him with the expression that had replaced yes in their private vocabulary. The look of someone who doesn't waste a certainty. He stood up and turned to Roy. She's going north. I'm going with her. Roy looked at Seraphine. Something worked through his face. The old suspicion, the old resistance, and then the memory of the Granger boy and the stamped weather predictions that Coulter had showed him over a fence repair in December. Not because he'd wanted to convince Roy of anything, but because the data was relevant to fence repair planning and Roy needed to understand it. How does she... I don't know exactly, Coulter said, but I trust it. You want to keep searching the west side or you want to find the boy? A beat. Go, Roy said. I'll put 2 men on the north approach behind you. They went north. The cedar breaks in the dark were the kind of terrain that was easy to get into and difficult to get out of. Low limestone ridges, cedar trunks close enough that a horse couldn't move at speed, the ground alternating between frozen mud and loose rock. Coulter moved his gelding carefully. Seraphine moved the red mare as if the terrain was no obstacle at all, reading the ground with her lantern held low, angling slightly east, then north again, then picking up something that made her angle steeper east. He followed. 20 minutes in, she stopped. She held her lantern up and swept it slowly to the right, and in the edge of that light, he saw it. A section of cedar trunk and loose rock that had come down at some point recently, a small fall of hillside, and at the base of it something that was not rock. A red coat. Small. He was off the gelding before the thought fully completed. He covered the distance in seconds, and the boy, Tommy Aldridge, 7 years old, hawk watcher, lost since morning, was wedged at the base of the fallen tree and rock with his left leg pinned and his face the gray-white color of a child who had been cold and scared for 4 hours and was past crying about it. "Hey," Coulter said, because it was the only thing that came. "Hey, Tommy. I've got you." The boy made a sound that was mostly breath. Seraphine was beside him. She went straight to the leg, assessing the pin, and shook her head once, not broken, just caught. She signed something quickly and pointed at the rock and then at Coulter and held up 3 fingers. 3, 2, 1. He lifted the rock section at her count, and she pulled the boy free in one clean motion, and the leg was scraped and bruised, but it was whole. She wrapped the boy in her coat without asking and held him with the specific quality of someone who understood what cold and fear had cost him and was not going to rush the recovery. Tommy Aldridge looked up at her with the loose, exhausted face of a child at the edge of everything he had, and she was looking back at him with that expression Coulter had seen her use with the horses. The patient, attentive, completely present expression of someone who had decided that this creature's fear was the only important thing right now. The boy stopped shaking first. Then he started crying properly, which was actually a good sign, and they both knew it. Coulter fired 2 shots into the air, the signal they'd agreed on with Roy. And within 20 minutes, the search party arrived, and then the Aldridges arrived. And then there was the noise and the light and the particular chaos of a child being restored to the people who needed him. Martha Aldridge took her son from Seraphine's arms with the kind of movement that didn't allow for politeness, just the pure animal grab of a mother getting her child back. She held him, and she wept, and she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she looked up at Seraphine. Seraphine was standing back from the group, her coat gone, her arms around herself in the cold, watching the reunion with an expression that was careful and a little apart. The expression, Coulter recognized, of someone who was not sure whether they were included in the circle or merely adjacent to it. Martha Aldridge crossed to her. She didn't have a way to say anything that Seraphine could receive. She stood in front of her for a moment, then took both of Seraphine's hands in hers and held them, hard, and pressed them once. Seraphine looked at the woman's hands holding hers. Something in her face cracked open, briefly, before she put it back together. Not grief, something older than grief, something that had been waiting a long time to be touched. Around them, the search party was standing in the loose circle of lanterns and cold breath, and Coulter watched the faces. Roy Mabry, Abel Deere, the Granger boy's father, Warren, standing to the left. And what he saw was not the careful, calculating expressions of men deciding whether to trust something unfamiliar. It was men standing with their hats off in the cold, watching a woman hold another woman's hands, and saying nothing because sometimes there is nothing to say, and the saying of nothing is its own form of acknowledgement. Roy Mabry caught Coulter's eye across the lantern light. He gave a single nod. It was not an apology. It was not a dramatic conversion. Roy Mabry was not a man who did dramatic conversions. It was a nod that meant "I see it," which was, from Roy Mabry, the most honest thing he had to offer, and Coulter received it as such. They rode back in a loose group, horses close enough that the warmth was shared, Tommy Aldridge asleep against his father's chest on a horse that was patient with its cargo. The cedar brakes behind them and the flat plain opening up ahead, the lights of the homestead scattered like something dropped and left where it fell. Coulter rode beside Seraphine. He watched her from the edge of his vision, her posture in the saddle, the way she was holding herself in the cold without his coat, and he unclipped his own coat's second layer and held it toward her without a word. She looked at it. He kept holding it out. She took it. She pulled it around her shoulders, and they rode together the rest of the way in the dark, close enough that occasionally the horse's shoulders touched. And the cold was the same cold it had always been, and the land was the same land, and something was different from what it had been that morning in a way that didn't need to be named to be true. The next week in town, nobody called her cursed. It was not replaced with anything dramatic. There was no ceremony, no formal revision of opinion. It was just an absence. The whispers were not there in the way they had been, the way a sound stops and you don't notice until the silence has a different quality and you understand something has changed. Rufus Hale said to Coulter at the mercantile counter, bagging flour, "Heard she found the Aldridge boy." "She did." Rufus tied the bag. "Good thing she was there." He said it the way people say things that have stopped costing them something. Easily, without looking up, already moving to the next item on the list. Coulter paid for the flour and said nothing else. He drove home with the wagon and the supplies and the cold air and the knowledge of a thing settling into its proper place after a long time in the wrong one. And he didn't examine it too closely because some things settle better when you leave them alone. He got home and found Seraphine in the barn, which was where she often was. And he put the supplies away and went to find her there, and she was braiding the red mare's mane with the focused, quiet attention she brought to everything. And the barn smelled like horse and hay and the cold that came under the door. And he leaned on the stall rail and watched her work. She looked up, raised her eyebrows. Well, he made the sign she had taught him early, the one for something being right, being correct, being what it should be. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the mare's mane and kept working, and he stayed at the rail, and the barn held them both in its ordinary and sufficient way. Spring came the way it always came to the Texas plains. Not gently, not dramatically, but with the blunt insistence of something that had been waiting a long time and was done waiting. The frost broke in the second week of March. The creek ran high and brown from snowmelt off the northern hills. The cedar brakes put out their small, unremarkable new growth, and the pasture grass came back in the thin, uncertain way of something testing whether it was safe to return. Coulter fixed the kitchen ceiling properly. New boards, matched as close as he could manage, the ridge planed down until it was level, and the whole thing re-chinked along the joins. It took 4 days and more cursing than he normally allowed himself, and when he was done, it was not perfect. You could still see, if you knew where to look, the line where old met new, but it was solid, and it was right, and it would hold. Seraphine watched him finish it from the doorway on the 4th day, her arms crossed, coffee in hand. He came down from the ladder and looked up at it. "Better," he said, and signed it. She tilted her head, studying the ceiling with the same attention she brought to livestock condition and storm clouds. Then she signed, "You can still see the line." "I know." She looked at him. "Does it bother you?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he thought about things. "Less than it did," he said. "Things that get fixed aren't the same as things that were never broken. Doesn't mean they're worse, just different." She held his gaze for a moment with the expression that meant she was filing something, not agreeing or disagreeing, just receiving it and putting it somewhere it would keep. Then she handed him the coffee. He took it and drank it and looked at the ceiling, and the line where old met new was just a line, and the ceiling held. March brought Judge Carver through the circuit, which meant county business got handled. Disputes, recordings, the administrative machinery of frontier civilization grinding through its seasonal cycle. Coulter rode in on a Wednesday to confirm the property registration was properly reflected in the judge's records. He was in and out of the courthouse in 20 minutes, which was a faster resolution than most county business allowed. And on his way back through town, he stopped at the Mercantile for feed and found 3 people he knew in conversation near the front. Warren Granger was one of them. Clara Aldridge, Tommy's mother, was another. The third was a man named Pete Sutton, who ran a small operation south of the creek and had, at the height of the whisper season, been one of the louder skeptics. They were talking about Seraphine. He understood this before he fully heard the words. It was the particular quality of the conversation, the way people talk about someone who is becoming reference rather than subject. Not the low, sliding talk of rumor. Something else. Clara was saying she knew before Dr. Pruitt did. He came out 2 weeks later and said the same things she'd already done. "Pruitt's slow," Warren said. "Not a criticism. Just the geography." "She's not slow," Clara said. I don't know what she is. But she knew. Pete Sutton turned when Coulter came in, and there was a moment, the old moment, the calculating pause. And then it passed. "Hayes." He nodded. "Heard she found the Aldridge boy." "She did." "And the Granger boy last fall." "Yes." Pete was quiet for a beat. "My wife's been having trouble with her back, past 2 months. Pruitt gave her something that didn't help." He paused. "You think if she was willing..." Coulter looked at the man. 6 months ago, Pete Sutton had been in the group that stood at his fence line with the whispers at his back. He was standing in the Mercantile now, asking for help, which required something from him, and it showed in his face, not embarrassment exactly, but the awareness of distance traveled. "I'll ask her," Coulter said. "It's her choice." He told Seraphine that evening. He laid it out plainly. Who it was, what he'd said before, what he was asking now. She listened. She thought about it for long enough that he knew she was actually thinking, not performing consideration. Then she signed, "When?" He blinked. "That's all? Just when?" She looked at him with mild patience. He needs help. His wife is in pain. That's enough. He sat with that for a moment. He thought about the economy of it. The complete absence of scorekeeping, the refusal to make Pete Sutton's past fear an invoice she was going to collect on. He thought about how much harder that was than it looked, and how she made it look like the only reasonable position. "Saturday," he said. "I'll send word." She nodded and went back to what she'd been doing. Pete Sutton's wife was better within 2 weeks. Whatever Seraphine did, the combination of poultice and heat, and the specific remedies she carried in the worn cloth bag she'd assembled over the winter from dried herbs and compounds, Coulter had stopped asking her to fully explain. It worked in the way her treatments usually worked. Not magically, not instantly, but steadily. The way things get better when the right attention is finally paid. Word moved the way word moved. By April, it was not unusual for Coulter to come home from a fence check and find a horse tied at the rail that wasn't his, a neighbor with a sick animal, or a child with a persistent cough, or a question about a coming storm that Pruitt couldn't answer and the almanac hadn't predicted. He learned to read Seraphine's end-of-day face for signs of depletion. She pushed herself harder than she indicated, worked until the work was done, and then found quiet to recover in. And he made it his private business to ensure she had that quiet, and to not schedule additional animals for treatment on the days after a particularly long one. She noticed him doing this. She didn't comment on it. The noticing was enough, for both of them. April moved into May and the ranch had its best spring in 4 years. The pasture grass came in strong. 2 of the mares foaled, both healthy. Coulter had found, almost by accident, that the systematic approach Seraphine used with the animals had practical lessons for his own management of them, and he'd adjusted his routines accordingly, and the results were in the ledger in plain numbers. He hired one hand for the season, a quiet young man named Davis, who came with good references from a ranch 2 counties over and who arrived, assessed the situation, and adapted to the unusual social arrangement of the Hayes Ranch with a pragmatism that Coulter appreciated. Davis addressed Seraphine as ma'am. He learned 6 signs in his first 2 weeks. He had no apparent opinions about anything beyond the work, which made him the best hired hand Coulter had employed in 5 years. It was a May evening, warm and still, the kind of evening the plains offered occasionally as compensation for everything else, when Coulter finally said the thing he had been carrying for months. He didn't plan it. He had, in fact, been systematically not planning it, which was its own kind of plan. He had decided, somewhere in the winter, that he was not going to manufacture a moment, was not going to approach it as a problem to be solved or a decision to be made with columns for and against. He was going to let it exist until it had to be addressed or until it became clear it didn't, and he was going to be honest about which one it was when he knew. They were sitting on the porch. This had become an evening habit since the weather warmed. An hour before dark, the 2 of them on the porch, with whatever they'd been drinking, watching the light change over the plains. Davis had gone to the bunkhouse. The horses were in. The work was done. Coulter had the notepad on his knee, which he'd started carrying outside because the evening sometimes produced conversation and signing was harder in low light. He wrote for a while without showing it to her. She was looking at the horizon, which was doing something with the color that May evenings did. Not quite gold, not quite red. A combination that existed only in that specific window of light and was gone quickly. He looked at what he'd written. He crossed part of it out. He wrote it differently. He crossed that out too. He looked at the horizon himself for a while. Then he wrote, "I don't have a clean way to say this. I've tried 4 times in my head and none of them came out right. So I'll just say it and you can do what you want with it." He handed her the notepad. She read it, looked at him, waited. He wrote, "This ranch needed something I didn't know how to give it before you came. I don't mean the work, though the work is better. I mean the thing underneath the work, the reason for it. I had the systems, but not the thing the systems are supposed to be in service of, and I'd been running on systems alone long enough that I'd stopped noticing what was missing." He handed it to her again. She read it slowly. Her face in the failing light was very still. He took the notepad back and wrote the last part, which was the part he'd been crossing out and rewriting, and which in the end came out simply because he ran out of ways to make it more complicated. I love you. I don't know what you want to do with that. It doesn't change anything about your situation here if you don't feel the same. I just needed you to know it, because carrying it without telling you stopped feeling honest about 3 months ago. He held it out. She took it. She read it. She read it again. The light was almost gone now, that specific window closing the way it always did, taking the color with it into the flat dark of a May evening in Texas. A coyote somewhere on the North Ridge said something to the sky. The creek made its small sound in the distance. Seraphine set the notepad on her knee. She picked up the pencil. She wrote for a while. He didn't watch her write. He looked at the ridge and listened to the coyote and waited with the patience that she had taught him, the patience of someone who has learned that time spent waiting on readiness is not time wasted. She handed him the notepad. She had written, "I have been waiting for you to say that since January. I was not going to say it first because I needed to know you arrived there yourself, and not because I needed somewhere to be. Those are different things. You understand that." He read it. He read the last sentence again. He understood it completely. She had needed to know that he was choosing her, not choosing what she solved for him. The distinction was real, and she had been precise enough to wait for it, through January and February and March and April, patient in the way of someone with very clear requirements and the self-possession to hold them. He wrote, "I understand it." She took the notepad back and wrote, "Then yes. That is my answer, yes." He looked at the word. He looked at her. She was already looking at him, and the expression on her face was not the careful, composed expression of a woman managing her presentation. It was just her, tired from a long day, warm from the evening, a smear of something on her left sleeve that was probably from the second mare's foaling check, hair coming loose at the back the way it always did by evening. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. They sat on the porch until the dark was complete and the stars came out over the Texas plains in the particular abundance that made you remember, if you'd forgotten, how far from everything else you actually were, and how that could be, depending on what you had with you, either the loneliest thing in the world or the opposite of that. They didn't rush inside. The hard things were not finished. Coulter knew this. He was not a man who confused a good evening for a permanent condition. There would be more price-type situations, men from her past who thought old arrangements had no expiration date. There would be winters and bad harvests and animals that didn't recover, and neighbors who needed more than he or she could give. There would be the ordinary difficulty of two imperfect people building a shared life without a blueprint, making it up from first principles, getting it wrong sometimes and right sometimes, and living in the space between. He knew all of that. He held her hand in the dark and knew it anyway. The following year brought changes that accumulated without announcement. Seraphine converted the bunkhouse's unused east room into a space for her herb work. Proper shelving, the right light, a drying rack Davis built from cedar poles because he'd understood without being asked that the work was real and deserved a real space. Coulter built a second animal pen on the south side of the barn because the need for it had been obvious for months, and the summer allowed the labor. People came, not always for illness, sometimes just to ask her something, a question about an animal or a plant, or whether the weather was going to hold for a harvest. She answered what she could and declined what she couldn't, and held the line between the two with the self-possession of someone who had long since stopped apologizing for her own limits. She started teaching. It began with the Aldridge boy. Tommy, recovered, 8 years old, and possessed of the specific curiosity of a child who had been found in the cedar breaks by someone unusual and had decided that unusual was interesting rather than frightening. He appeared at the ranch on a Saturday with his mother's permission and a list of questions that he delivered by writing them on a piece of paper and holding it up, because someone had told him Seraphine couldn't hear, and he had concluded, with the logic of an 8-year-old, that writing was therefore the appropriate technology. She had looked at the list. She had looked at him. She had pointed to the barn. He had followed. By summer there were 4 children who came on Saturdays. By fall there were 7. They learned about plants and animals and weather and the specific practical knowledge of the natural world that Seraphine carried, not as mysticism, but as literacy. The ability to read the land the way you read a sentence, one element at a time until the whole thing made sense. Coulter watched this from a distance and thought about what it meant that the same county which had sent men to his fence with torches of opinion was now sending its children to learn from a woman they'd once called cursed. He didn't say this out loud. Some observations were better kept as private evidence of what was possible when fear ran out of fuel. Roy Mabry stopped by in September. Not for any specific reason. He said he was checking the road condition from the east, which was the kind of thin pretext that Roy used when he had something to say but hadn't framed it yet. Coulter gave him coffee and waited. Roy sat at the kitchen table and looked around at the room. The patched ceiling, the shelves with their organized jars, the 2 coffee cups that had been 2 coffee cups for nearly a year now, and he said without preamble, "I owe you an apology." Coulter said nothing. "I was wrong about her," Roy said. "I know you know that. I know the whole county knows it. I'm saying it to you directly because that's how apologies work." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "She's done more good in this county in 1 year than most people do in 10, and I was one of the people who tried to run her off. I wanted to say that out loud to you, so at least it's been said." Coulter looked at the man across the table. Roy Mabry was 61 years old, stubborn, imperfect, shaped by a lifetime of a particular county's particular fears. He was also sitting in a chair in the kitchen of a ranch he'd once ridden to with demands, saying a hard thing plainly. "She knows," Coulter said. Roy frowned. I haven't said it to her." "She knows anyway," Coulter said. "That's one of her things." Roy sat with that. Then something in his face shifted into something that might, after enough years, become wisdom. "Suppose I ought to say it to her directly, too." "Suppose you ought to," Coulter agreed. Roy did. He found her in the herb room, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said his piece, and Coulter didn't watch, gave them the privacy of the yard, worked on a section of fence that didn't urgently need working on. But he heard Roy come back out 10 minutes later, and the sound of his horse leaving, and when he came back inside, Seraphine was at the herb shelves with her back to the door, and her shoulders not quite level. And he understood that the uneven shoulders meant it had cost her something, and also that she'd received it, filed it in the place where things that mattered went. He put water on for tea and left her to it. Later that evening, under the cottonwood tree at the east edge of the property. It had become their tree, the place they went when the porch felt too close to the house and they wanted something wider. She signed to him. He meant it. I know he did. People change slowly. She paused. But they change. He thought about Roy Mabry with his hat in his hands. He thought about Pete Sutton in the mercantile, asking for help with the embarrassment of distance traveled showing on his face. He thought about 7 children on Saturday mornings learning to read weather and plants and the land they lived on. Some of them do, he said. She tilted her head. You don't believe it fully. He was quiet for a moment. I believe it enough, he said. I don't need to believe in people in general. I believe in the ones in front of me. She held his gaze in the evening light, and her face had the quality it sometimes had. Reading him the way she read everything, not to judge it, but to understand it precisely. She signed, That's enough. That's all it needs to be. The cottonwood moved above them in the September air. The plains stretched out in every direction, the way the plains always did, indifferently, enormously, without regard for the small human things happening at their edge. A hawk turned slow circles over the far pasture. The creek said its small ongoing thing to the ground. He thought about what the county called her now. He'd heard it from 3 separate people in the past month, each time spoken the way people speak something that has settled into common use, without ceremony, without explanation. The woman who listens with her heart. It was the kind of name that got built from accumulated evidence, from 100 small moments that individually meant little and together meant everything. He looked at her sitting beside him under the cottonwood and thought about a livestock auction in November with mud on the ground and a crowd that had decided before it looked. He thought about a rope on a woman's wrists and the particular quality of endurance that had told him something the crowd had missed. He thought about 17 weather predictions in a ledger, a child's fever breaking, a kitchen ceiling that was patched but solid, a note passed across a kitchen table that said yes. He thought about what it meant that he had arrived at the best year of his life by accident, by impulse, by the kind of decision that isn't really a decision at all, but a recognition. The moment you see what's actually in front of you and act accordingly before the moment closes. He had not been looking for anything at that auction. He had simply seen clearly for once, which was rarer than most people admitted. She was looking at the horizon the way she looked at horizons, reading something in the light that he had learned over the past year to partially read alongside her. He was not as good at it as she was. He was better than he'd been. That was all you could ask, to be better than you'd been, to keep the distance between where you were and where you needed to be moving in the right direction. He took her hand. She turned from the horizon and looked at him, not with the managed expression, not with the careful, composed face she still wore sometimes when she was uncertain of her footing. Just her face, just the particular person he had arrived at, stumbled into, chosen. She signed, one-handed because he was holding the other. I never needed sound. He looked at her hand in his. He thought about everything he'd ever said into a silence he thought she couldn't hear. About, I heard you from the very beginning as something he'd been thinking longer than he knew. About how the quiet between two people could be the emptiest thing in the world or the fullest, depending entirely on what had been built inside it. He signed back, slowly, with his free hand. I heard you, from the beginning. I heard you. She looked at his signs, she looked at him. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was a thing she did sometimes now in the private spaces of their life together. Simple, unannounced, entirely itself. Above them, the cottonwood moved in the September air. The hawk came down from its circles and landed somewhere out of sight. The plains went on being the plains. They sat there until the light was gone. And in the dark, in the ordinary silence of two people who had learned to live inside it together, there was nothing missing. There was nothing that needed to be added or explained or fixed. Some things are exactly what they are. That was enough. That was everything.